Welcome to the History of Nerds and Nerd podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Haley Gilliland, A Flower Traveled in My Blood, the incredible true story of the grandmothers who fought to find a stolen generation of children. This is one of those stories I don't know why I've never heard it before. I don't know how nobody has written like this about this before. Long story short, Argentina went through a lot of stuff. Some kids went missing, and their grandmas spent decades trying to find them, sometimes successfully, which just caused even more complex questions. It's an incredible story. I think Haley does a wonderful job with it. It was great to talk to her, so how about I shut up so you can hear from her. And here we are with author Haley Gilliland. A Flower Traveled in My Blood, the incredible true story of the grandmothers who fought to find a stolen generation of children. Haley, thank you so much for coming on.
Brendan, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Now, listen, you're very, very fancy, but I want to disarm you and the audience right away. I did some hardcore research, and I think I found the best publicity photo of a journalist I've ever seen. Would you say that The Economist, I believe the article is The Spread of Cryotherapy.
Oh, no.
Is the best. Listeners, you can Google it on your phone right now.
Please don't.
Would you say that's your best publicity photo ever?
Oh, yeah, I think that has to be the number one contender. It's really hard to beat that. The backstory is essentially that when I was working for The Economist magazine, covering the Western United States based in Los Angeles, I noticed that there was a trend in LA of cryotherapy studios spreading across the city. And so I pitched it to my editor and he liked the idea. And so, of course, being the intrepid journalist that I am, I had to go experience one of these studios firsthand. And as I was absolutely freezing, shivering in this machine, you have to stay in for 3 minutes. The operator snapped a picture of me. I sent it to my editor as kind of a joke, and he put it in the magazine. I say this on my website, but there's a moral to that story, which is always establish your ground rules before sending your editor any embarrassing reporting pics.
I will say this, you are a professional. You look like you're having a good time. You're clearly not, but you made it look like you are.
Yeah, well, looks can be deceiving.
Listen, we're about to get into heavy stuff. We're going to go through a lot of Argentina's history that is not fantastic. What I wanted to start out with is what even brought Argentina into your life? What do you love about it? We're going to talk about some dark stuff. I'd like to know, when you see that country, what do you see, and kind of how did you get led to this story?
That's such a great question. And my relationship with Argentina really started in 2009. I was lucky to travel there with my family while I was in college. And I often live in my head. I'm often driven by analytical inputs. But every once in a while, I just get a very strong, visceral gut reaction to something. And I had that to just being in Argentina. And I actually had food poisoning the entire time I was there, so it was even more remarkable. But I just felt this intense pull to the country, to the people, to the history. I just really felt a need to return there at some point for a longer stretch of time when I didn't have food poisoning. And so after graduating college in 2011, I moved down on what was meant to be a 1-year research fellowship. And my suspicions were confirmed. I quickly realized that I absolutely loved it there and was hoping to find a way to stay for longer than a year. That was how I was first introduced to the story of the Abuelas, because I moved down with what I thought was a working knowledge of the Argentine dictatorship. As I said, I'd visited before as a tourist. I'd also taken a Latin American politics class in college that touched on the Argentine dictatorship. But upon arriving in the country and living there for an extended period of time, I realized how little I really knew. And the thing that most shocked me was the story of the Abuelas.
And I talked to a lot of journalists, and they do talk about that. Writing a book is almost like a completely different thing than writing an article or something like that. And when I look at this book, before I opened it, I said, this just seems like there's a lot to cover between people and events and government changes. Was that very intimidating for you to say, how do I take this huge story and not let it kind of take over and go down these wrong tangents and things like that?
Absolutely. It was very intimidating at the beginning. I also just once again had this gut instinct that even though I was very daunted by it, I just had to do it. I think it was intimidating for a couple of reasons. One, when I looked at a lot of my favorite narrative history books, the time period covered is very compressed. So to give you an example, one of the books that I read in the past couple of years, or I guess it was almost 5 years ago now, but that I loved was Erik Larson's The Splendid and the Vile. And that takes place over the course of 1 year. And meanwhile, I was trying to figure out how to compress, or rather not compress, but do justice to 70 years in Argentina's history. And so that was quite an intimidating prospect at the beginning. And the way that I decided to approach it was to tell this massive history through the very human stories of basically one family, and to really try to bring readers into the lives of one family as a means of accessing the history of the Abuelas movement and Argentina's broader history. And that felt both more accessible to me, and I thought it would also make the history more accessible to readers rather than having it feel like they were eating their broccoli when reading the more historical sections.
It's a big title to bring up, but I think especially for a lot of the publicity items that are coming up, they mention Say Nothing, which I think is very apt because it's a book that you think you're about to read about this small piece of a bigger event, and then it explodes and you realize that it can't just be about one family. You have to talk about who's in charge of the government, who is in charge of the police or the paramilitaries. And then ultimately you have to talk about people that are only in for a few pages because they, let's just say, disappear for now. Anybody who reads the book will find out more. When you start this up and you're focusing on Rosa, let's talk about her. Who is she? How is she part of this story?
Rosa Rosenblit was born in 1919 in a tiny Argentine hamlet in the center of the country in what are called the Pampas, so the fertile grasslands in the interior of Argentina. And Rosa Rosenblit was the daughter of two Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire who both came at the turn of the 20th century to Argentina in search of safety at a time when the pogroms were happening in the Russian Empire. And her family quickly converted itself into very successful Argentine ranchers. And Moises Ville, where she lived, was this really interesting town in that it was 99% Jewish. So the town mayor was Jewish, all the town doctors were Jewish, there were Jewish libraries, there were a host of temples to choose from. And so this Jewish community really made a thriving diaspora in the center of Argentina. But Rosa always had greater ambitions for herself. She always had this sense that she wanted to live somewhere bigger and experience life outside of the flat and interminable Pampas. And so she got an opportunity when she was around 15 years old to train to be an obstetrician in the city of Rosario. And even though she was only 15, she took it and she moved away from her family and trained to become an obstetrician. And she moved around for her career in obstetrics and ultimately landed in Buenos Aires, where she met the man that would later become her husband, Benjamin. And even though Rosa had tons of experience delivering other women's babies, she really struggled with pregnancy herself. She suffered from a late-term miscarriage that was really devastating when she was already 5 months pregnant. And then ultimately, when she got pregnant again, she had very premature contractions. And so she was ordered to stay on bed rest for basically 8 months, which was very counter to her character. She has a ton of energy, and I think bed rest was not really something that was comfortable for her. And ultimately, in 1952, she gave birth to her first and only child, Patricia Julia Rosenblit. And to fast forward about 25 years, Patricia ended up being among the thousands of Argentines that were disappeared by the Argentine military. And she happened to be 8 months pregnant with her second child at the time that happened. And after getting her bearings, after a couple of months of visiting every police station and courthouse and anywhere Rosa could think to look for Patricia, Rosa learned of this group of women that had started to meet that were in the same situation she was. They were also missing not only their children, who had disappeared, but also they were looking for grandchildren because their children were either pregnant at the time of their disappearances or had been taken along with their small children. And so around the end of 1978, the beginning of 1979, Rosa joined the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and she was a central figure in the Abuelas for decades. She only recently stepped back from her active role there. She's now 105 years old, turning 106 in August. And yeah, she was a very central actor in the Abuelas movement for so many years.
And I don't want to skate too far past this. She goes looking for her daughter. Even asking questions could have gotten her killed, right? Like, this was not a situation where you can innocently go and try and figure out where your kid was. Even asking the question put you and everyone you loved in danger at this point, right?
Absolutely. And the way Rosa describes it is she didn't know the extent of what was happening. Many Argentines didn't know the extent of what was happening, or they willfully chose to ignore what was happening because even knowing could put you in danger. So Rosa, as I said, submitted habeas corpus writs to the government that had her full name, her address, all of this identifying personal information that the government very easily could have used to abduct her as well. And she did this without knowing that the year prior, the government had actually disappeared 3 women who were just protesting the disappearance of their children at the end of 1977. 2 of them were dragged out of a busy church, and one was snatched from a busy street. And much later, it would surface that they were actually pushed from planes alive over the Rio de la Plata, and then their bodies would not be identified for decades.
I don't know how to not do a 3-hour podcast, but hopefully since you wrote the book, you could do this. How did Argentina's government get like this? Because I don't think you can, from my reading of the book, you can't place it on just there's one villain in this. And this person did this, and that's why everything ended up the way it did, and these activities were being done. Is there a short way to try to explain how Argentina's government fell into this type of, lack of a term, despotic government?
Okay, I'm going to try my best to be concise.
Right, it's tough.
It is tough. Between 1930 and 1976, when the coup that I talk about in the book took place, there were 6 coups in Argentina. And that's just counting the coups that represented transitions between democratic and military governments. So it was a time of immense tumult, and essentially Argentina's political and economic situation looked a lot like a pendulum that just sort of swung back and forth between military rule and democratic rule. And that weakened democratic institutions, of course, and created a lot of disgruntlement in the society, a lot of polarization in the society. And the coup of 1976 followed a couple of particularly chaotic years. In 1974, Juan Domingo Perón, who for all intents and purposes is the most important Argentine politician of the 20th century, passed away and essentially divided the country into 2 warring factions, Peronists and anti-Peronists. And sometimes the lines between those are a little bit blurry, as you would know from reading the book. But there was a ton of polarization, and it spawned a surge in revolutionary groups, both on the left and on the right, that began to clash really violently, and that violence escalated in 1974, in 1975, and in the early months of 1976, to the point that in 1975, newspaper reports hold that there was a bombing in Argentina every 3 hours and a political killing every 5. And so the military did not actually meet with much resistance at all when it decided to take power in March of 1976. There were many people in Argentine society that supported the military and believed that military rule was what was needed to restore order and clamp down on violence and improve the economy, which was also in shambles. But they really could not have predicted the scale of terror that was unleashed after March 24th, 1976, when the military government started what was called the National Reorganization Process, which was a very bland name for an absolutely terrifying plan to not only try to clamp down on political violence, but essentially purge the country of anyone that the military government deemed to have ideas that were contrary to its conservative Western Catholic values. So there's a famous quote from Jorge Rafael Videla, who was the first president of the military dictatorship, who said, essentially, one becomes a terrorist not only by killing with a weapon or setting a bomb, but also by encouraging others through ideas that go against our Western and Christian civilization. And so this was the ideology of the Argentine military junta. And at the same time, they took power in a context of dictatorships that had proliferated across the region. And so they had had time to study what these other dictatorships had done in places like Chile, Uruguay, Brazil. And something that they noticed about Chile, which also tried to purge the country of people that the military regime deemed to have ideas that were not in line with its values, but they were quite bold about it. They didn't do much to try to obfuscate what they were doing. And so the Argentine junta decided it was going to do things differently, and the terror that it perpetrated was both vastly different on its scale. They ended up killing far more people than in other South American dictatorships, but also very different in its secrecy. So the Argentine dictatorship really attempted to maintain plausible deniability. And it was a very tricky dance where they would abduct people in broad daylight, but they would do so in civilian clothing, in unmarked cars without license plates, because they wanted plausible deniability, where even if the Argentine populace and the international community thought they knew what was going on, they couldn't quite prove it. And so that is how, in my view, this dictatorship ended up being so much more brutal than some of the dictatorships in the surrounding countries.
So into this horrible, horrible situation, we have the Abuelas who step into a government that will already take people anyway and disappear them. There's no rule of law, really. And then on top of that, these Abuelas are looking for people they don't know exist anymore. And for grandchildren that they don't, because for a lot of these women were taken while pregnant, right? Which means these Abuelas, which, you know, they got their name originally, are just looking for their kids and then realize that there's grandkids out there that they need to be looking for. How fast did these parents go from, I'm looking for my children, to I'm now looking for my grandchildren? Was that an immediate thought in their heads, or is that something they grew into?
So a group of mothers banded together in Argentina in April of 1977 to look for and protest the disappearance of their children. And they had started to recognize each other in these long and interminable lines that would form outside of government buildings, where relatives looking for their loved ones who were missing would line up to seek information from the government that was actually doing the disappearing. But the relatives didn't know this at the time. And there were several women that began to recognize each other in these lines and decided to meet and discuss their situations and see if together there was anything that they might be able to do to rectify what they were going through. And so they began meeting in April of 1977 and determined that every week they were going to march in the Plaza de Mayo, which is this iconic square in front of the presidential palace in Argentina. And every Thursday at 3:30, they decided they would gather in the Plaza de Mayo and demand answers from the government about their disappeared children. And after a couple of months of this, about 12 of the mothers realized that in addition to looking for their disappeared children, they all shared something else in common, which was that they were looking for grandchildren that had been stolen as well, either while still in their mother's wombs or as very, very small children. And so those grandmothers who had begun as part of this mothers group decided to begin meeting separately in addition to their weekly protests with the mothers in order to further discuss the question of looking for their grandchildren.
How many of them were you able to talk to directly? Because I would love to look at them and say, thank God you're very brave, but also you're kind of out of your mind. Because it could have gone so badly so fast. In some cases it did. Were you able to talk to a lot of them? Because they're, as we talked about with Rosa, Rosa's much older. How much direct primary source material were you able to get for this?
Yeah, so I was able to meet with 5 abuelas who were still living at the time that I started this project. Sadly, 2 of them have since passed away. A theme that came up in speaking with them is that either they didn't really know the extent of the danger that they were subjecting themselves to when they began looking for their grandchildren, and by the time they found out, they didn't really care because the worst thing that could possibly happen to them already had. They had lost their children and they didn't know where their grandchildren were or if they'd even been born or if they were even alive. And so many of the abuelas just really felt like they had nothing to lose, and their love for their family and their drive to find their family outstripped any fear that they felt. And it's not that they didn't feel fear. Many of them admit to feeling lots of fear, but that emotion was overshadowed by the compulsion to look for their family.
I mean, just Rosa as an example, the woman that you present in this book, I don't think she would have given a damn if she knew from day one just how dangerous it was. I have to think that she's kind of a godsend for an author. She is that main character that you want, that is going to look fear in the face and go right past it and just continue to push no matter how much she gets pushed back. I mean, did Rosa just kind of jump out at you right away that you're like, here's my main character?
Yeah, so immediately upon learning Rosa's story and reading past interviews that she had done, I fell in love with her. She has an extremely feisty personality. She's very funny. And also for a journalist, she had another extremely compelling quality, which is she prides herself on being honest and unvarnished. And of course, for my purposes, that is everything. And so immediately she was really, really compelling. But I had to figure out if I would be able to speak with her. At the time I started this project in 2021, she was 102 years old. And I was very lucky on my first reporting trip back to Argentina for this project that I got to meet with her in her apartment and get to know her a little bit in person. That was a complete honor and also so much fun. You know, when she felt that she was done with the interview and was feeling tired, she excused me by singing a song and clapping as I walked out the door. And what I didn't realize at the time was that that would be my only chance to interview her in person. Soon after that interview, she moved into an assisted care facility, and I was essentially told by those close to her that she was no longer in condition to speak with me or to give interviews. So I feel immensely grateful that I was able to meet her. And it forced me to really go deeper in other ways. So I read and listened to and watched every interview, documentary, any sort of journalistic project that she had been involved in. I voraciously hoovered those up. And then I was very lucky that over the course of the 4.5 years that I was reporting and writing this project, her family donated her personal archive to an archive in Argentina, and I was able to spend a week in the archive pouring through every single box that had been donated and reading her correspondence, her travel diaries, looking at photos of when she was young, looking at her wedding photos. And that was immensely helpful for feeling like I could portray her in her full colors, because she is an immensely colorful and vivid person. And I wanted that to come through in the book.
Which it does. And because you have so much information, right, not just from Rosa, we also have decades after a lot of this has happened, which means now the grandchildren have grown up. And there are some really uncomfortable questions that you have in this book that I still can't answer for myself. Just to give an example, I don't think it's a spoiler warning, that some of the grandchildren are found. And there was basically two types of adoptions. One where the parents, the adopted parents, knew exactly where these babies came from, that they were taken from women who were then executed and they were stolen. And this one just chills me to the bone. There are people who then adopted these children not knowing where they came from, thought that they were just taking in a kid and adopting and doing the right thing. And then all of a sudden, years later, somebody knocks on the door and says, this child was kidnapped. And then the question becomes, where does this child go? Because they might have been living with somebody 5, 6, 7 years. These are the only parents they know. These parents didn't do anything. And then you're left with that question of what's the right thing to do now? I mean, when you come across that, I have to think that's tough, because you're sitting there going, you can't really take sides. You can just put out this horrible Sophie's Choice to the reader. What did you think about when you came across those instances?
Those stories were immensely powerful for me to learn about. They occurred most frequently at the beginning of the Abuelas journey, when the grandchildren that they were looking for were still minors. And so they had to fight for custody if they were to try to reclaim them. And the Abuelas really grappled with this as well. It was not immediately clear in many of these cases what they were going to fight to do. You know, to many of the grandmothers, it was inconceivable, once they had located their grandchildren, to leave them with a family that was not their true family, that in many ways felt like an abomination to the memory of their children who had been disappeared. It just felt contrary to nature's laws to do that. And at the same time, they recognized what you just mentioned, that these children had already experienced immense trauma, at least the children who were alive at the time that their parents were taken, and that reclaiming them would necessarily mean exposing them to another huge transition that would be incredibly hard for them. And so the Abuelas really struggled with many of these decisions early on in their history and didn't necessarily know what to do themselves oftentimes.
And while I'm not a huge fan of this, there is science in this, and especially at this particular time, the science is not settled. Right now, we think about DNA. I can tell you exactly who this person comes from and who this person comes from, or I can say this person did definitely not part of the family. The time frame we're talking about right now, this was not settled science. This was not exact like it is today. And that just kind of adds another huge wrinkle to this, which is we think that's our grandchild, and then let's just make this more complicated. Why don't we?
Right, exactly. So until 1984, the Abuelas didn't have any way to scientifically prove who their grandchildren were when they found those who they suspected might be their relatives. They could gather immense amounts of circumstantial evidence, and they did. They did this through very enterprising detective work. Sometimes they would actually don disguises and put on acts in order to more closely observe children that they thought might be their stolen grandchildren. In one case, a group of Abuelas dressed up as baby product saleswomen, and they pretended to be going door to door selling some sort of cream or appliance. And so they would knock on the door, and then the homeowner would open the door, and they would explode into this chorus of salesy chants about whatever product they were supposedly selling. But all the while, they were peering past the homeowner to see if any clues that there was a child in the house, or, even better, if they could catch a glimpse of a child who lived there. So looking for tiny shoes or strollers. They also combed government registries and looked for signs of fake birth certificates. Argentina is a country where home births, at least at that time, were very rare. And so if you could find a birth certificate in the years between 1976 and 1983 that documented a home birth that was signed by a military doctor, that immediately raised red flags for the Abuelas, and that was cause for further investigation. And so these were the tools that they used in the period prior to 1984. In 1984, they began working with a renowned American geneticist named Mary Claire King. And Mary Claire King would later become famous globally for discovering the BRCA gene that predicts breast cancer. The Abuelas and Mary Claire King were able to develop a very pioneering genetic test that allowed grandparents to be linked to grandchildren genetically without blood from the intermediary generation, which in the case of the Abuelas and their mission, that intermediary generation had been disappeared by the military. They didn't have blood from their children. And so Mary Claire King and a larger team helped the Abuelas develop this method that really allowed them to start proving with a high degree of probability who their grandchildren were, and demonstrating this to the courts in a way that allowed them to reclaim a lot more grandchildren after this method was invented.
So we've talked about horror on top of horror on top of horror. Let's do one more. So the grandchildren are now a little bit older, the ones that we're finding. When they're, no longer minors, they are adults. Then it becomes a question of, do these people have a right not to know? Which happened in quite a few cases where there were actually people who said, I know you think I may be one of these disappeared children, but I don't want to know. I've had these parents for years. They've loved me. Leave me alone. It's my right to not know until you know. And this was just another horrible episode that I just keep, I know sometimes I don't like too many buzzwords or anything, but it's just another part of this absolutely generational trauma where the one crime in the center has ruined the lives of so many generations. And then you get to the end of it and you say, well, whose rights do we violate, or whose rights do we respect? What did you think about that when you get to that last part? Because it almost feels like the trauma just never stops.
Definitely. That question really blew my mind. That was a very, very thorny one, and a question that I really grappled heartily with and also enjoyed thinking about at the same time. I think the question of, as you said, whose rights are respected? Is it a society's right? Do we prioritize the collective right for a society to know who its citizens are? Or do we respect the individual's right to privacy and to choose what they want to know and don't want to know about their history? And I think the Abuelas argument was a crime has been committed here, and the state is duty-bound to investigate it. And it is inconceivable to allow the right of the individual to trump that mandate to investigate the crime here, even if it is decades old. Even if something is stolen many years ago, it doesn't obviate the crime that was committed, and the state still needs to investigate. So it was a really tricky one. But I think what was most interesting to me in the research process was that even the grandchildren who most vehemently resisted knowing their identities ultimately not only came around, but really embraced the Abuelas and the Abuelas movement. I delve into a couple of those stories in the book, but there are many instances. In fact, I would say the majority. There's one story that I go into in the book, a man named Ezekiel Tauro Rochestein. And Ezekiel managed to evade genetic testing for 10 years. He desperately wanted to avoid being tested. He felt like the people who had raised him were his real parents, and nobody could tell him otherwise, even if a genetic test might. So he would do things like fill a gym bag with somebody else's toothbrush and gym clothing in case his apartment was raided by forensics experts, so that he could hand them a bag with somebody else's DNA all over it to really hinder the process. And he pulled these stunts for about 10 years until finally he was compelled to give a genetic sample and found out that he was indeed the son of Desaparecidos. And Ezequiel has since really embraced the Abuelas and their cause. He's done interviews along with them and is involved in their mission. And that is a theme that I found was quite common, even with the cases where initially the grandchild was quite resistant.
It's one of the few cases where I read something and I went, wow, I feel the worst for the judge. Because it's just, you're probably not sleeping that night. No, there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. It's just you have to live with whatever you decide. I think another aspect of this that I really appreciate, I am this type of person, especially reading history. The Abuelas also weren't perfect themselves. And you have a lot of women with very strong personalities, and thank God for that. But there's also a little bit of infighting as well. And I noticed you didn't shy away from that. You kind of reported that. Is that just the journalist in you? Did you think it was really important to kind of show that side of it as well?
I thought it was really important because, as you said, these are incredible women, but they are humans. And humans are complicated and they're not one-dimensional. And even our greatest heroes in our history, and I do think the Abuelas are heroes, are complicated and have had complicated moments in their history. And so I felt like this is a book about truth and the Abuelas' fight to defend truth, their search for truth. And so not telling the truth about some of their more difficult moments just felt incongruent with their mission and the spirit of the book.
Now, you got to talk to a lot of people, but I want to say, if I can magically get you in the room with somebody from the book that you can't talk to now for whatever impossibility, if I give you 1 hour with one person from the book that you haven't spoken to, who would it be?
Such a great question.
Authors always hate this one.
I hate it because how much time do you have? Can I list 10 people?
I will give you 2 if you really want it, but I've never allowed more than 2.
Okay, well, that definitely makes it easier. I would go back in time and get to know Patricia Roy-Semblit and Jose Manuel Perez. They are Rosa's daughter and son-in-law, both of whom were disappeared. And with many of the people whose stories are portrayed in this book, even if I wasn't able to speak with them at length, there was a trove of other interviews that they had done on camera or audio interviews that they had done. I could listen to their voice. I could see the gestures that they made. I could see what their smile looked like. And with Patricia and Jose Manuel, they were completely disappeared. There's no record of their voices. I don't know what they looked like when they were mad. I don't know how they reacted when they were excited. And I was really privileged. I felt like I did get a very rich window into who they were through a really special document that was entrusted to me. So starting in the 1990s, the Abuelas started putting together what are called archival biographical family archives. In Spanish, they're archivos biográficos familiares. And essentially what they are thick compendiums of interviews with people that knew the disappeared parents of the grandchildren that they were searching for, so that when a grandchild was found, they were presented with this very, very rich document that allowed them to really get to know their family history and really get to know their parents beyond the very grim details of their disappearance, which are recorded in other government archives. And in my case, I was entrusted with a 300-page biographical family archive with close friends and family members of Patricia and Jose. And so I was able to learn, for example, that Jose's love of the Beatles ran so deep that he named his dog Paulina after Paul McCartney. And I learned that he used to play pranks on his little cousins, and he would scatter their dolls across the vacant lot next to the house of one of their relatives. And I learned that Patricia was really funny and full of life, and that she loved the Uruguayan poet Benedetti. So I felt like I was able to get to know them, but there were aspects of them that remained out of reach for me because they were disappeared. And so they would be the two people that I would meet.
Now, we've talked about a lot. I want to go back to one of the first questions I asked you, is that your love for Argentina. When you dig into this much horrific trauma and horrors, does it make you love Argentina more because you know more of that history? Does it make it harder to kind of look past those things? I just know, I've spoken to police detectives who they live in a hometown and that's where they work and they love it, but then there's just so much that's built on it that when they look at a building, they see, oh, I know what happened there and I know what happened there. For you, did it deepen your love, or did it make it harder to enjoy Argentina when you were done with all of this?
That's really interesting. I think it didn't necessarily deepen or diminish my love, but it complicated it. And I think complicated love is a theme that runs throughout the book. In most of the book, it comes up in the context of families. And, I think most true love is complicated love. So I still love Argentina, but I also recognize the horrors in its past, just as I love the United States, but, recognize that there's a lot in our history that is imperfect would be not quite strong enough a word to describe it. So
something bad happened here? I wasn't aware. I don't know what you're talking about. We'll talk about it after we turn off recording. All right, let's lighten it up a little bit. I always love talking to super smart people like yourself, very well read. Do you have time to read nonfiction for fun? If you do, can you tell me a couple of your favorites? Or you can also just tell me, do you have any author friends who have books coming out and you want to plug them?
Oh my gosh, Brendan, how much time do we have?
Honestly, we can just keep going. Let's just do it.
Yeah, so, to me, reading narrative nonfiction is like breathing. I need it to live.
I'm there with you. I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So even at the most intense moments of this project, I wouldn't necessarily make a lot of progress with the books that I was trying to read, but I actually revisited a lot of books for inspiration. And so I can talk about a couple of those. But before I do, my husband and I have very different approaches to our bedside tables. Mine looks like a Leaning Tower of Babel. I often have like 15 books stacked on there, and his has a measly one.
He is, by the way, doing it the correct way. Lady History Nerd would agree with your way, and we've talked about that. It's absolute chaos. I'm sorry, we're off topic. Go right back to it.
It's a tower to my ambitions to read this great tower of books with all of the other commitments that life has. Yeah, I revisited a lot of old favorites during the course of writing this book to try to parse how authors that I really admire did certain things. The first book that really made me fall in love with this genre, and I was introduced to it in college because the author I was very privileged to have as a professor, is The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by Anne Fadiman. Anne Fadiman is one of the most beautiful writers in the world, and this book is just a masterpiece. It's about a family of Hmong refugees in Northern California and basically the collision of cultures as the Hmong family tries to navigate the American medical system. And the fusion of history and personal narrative is just so masterfully done that was a book I returned to often to try to parse how she pulled that off. I had the privilege of working for Steve Call for a short period after college as a fact checker on his book about ExxonMobil called Private Empire. And his books are just such examples of what excellent narrative nonfiction looks like, and displayed just a depth of research that is unparalleled. And I returned to them a lot during the course of this process. Say Nothing, of course, is a book that's come up in the course of this conversation and is another aspirational model. And there were a lot of thematic overlaps between the story that Patrick Radden Keefe tells in Say Nothing and the story recounted in my book. And he was immensely generous to me during this process. And we had a conversation where I got to pick his brain about how he navigated various things. So I'm really grateful to him. Hidden Valley Road by Bob Kulker, I returned to a lot. I mean, so many. I could go on and on and on.
I'm the same way. That's why I have a blog and podcast, because otherwise people would shoot me to shut me up.
You're giving me the food for thought. Maybe I'll add that to the list, but you're doing it so well already. So,
well, listen, I can't keep you forever, so I have to ask my last question. We just talked about how wonderful narrative nonfiction is. You and I know we're simpatico on this, but there are people out there who don't realize how good it is. Somebody who would say history is boring, it's a class I took in high school. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, okay, fine, Haley, I'll hear you out. Why should I read A Flower Traveled in My Blood? What would you say?
This is so tough because for me, as it seems like you experience history this way as well, my love for history is so visceral. It is so electrifying for me that it's hard to intellectually parse what's going on. But just as you did a little bit of deep research into my background with the cryotherapy photo, I did a tiny bit of research into you.
How dare you?
We share a love of shipwrecks. And I took a class in college that was titled Underwater Archaeology. And the entire class was about shipwrecks and how shipwrecks are excavated and how to analyze the relics that are recovered from shipwrecks. And it almost made me want to switch my major from history to archaeology. But I realized that actually what was compelling to me about it is why I love narrative nonfiction books and why I want to do this type of work. And that is because I love the idea of salvaging stories that might otherwise go overlooked and sharing them with people. And I love the idea of taking human stories, so smaller stories that are not necessarily dry and academic treatments of history, and telling much larger historical stories through the stories of people that lived through that history in a way that hopefully for the reader feels vital and colorful and immersive. And so I would hope that even a baseline interest in people and in families would be enough to make A Flower Traveled in My Blood a compelling read for you. And if you're not interested in people and their stories, then God help you, I have nothing for you.
Well, listen, you just mentioned this, and I have to bring this up, especially fellow shipwreck lover, as you said. One of the people that has blurbed your book is Hampton Sides, who, when it comes to In the Kingdom of Ice, is one of the greatest shipwreck stories of all time. That has to be a pinch me moment when you find out Hampton Sides is on board for this bad boy.
Oh, absolutely. And if I had taken more time to list all of my narrative nonfiction inspirations, he would have been next on the list. I am so grateful to him and was so surprised and honored. And yeah, I especially love Blood and Thunder. That was a book that I devoured when I moved to Los Angeles to cover the Western United States, about Kit Carson. But all of his books are so wonderful. So I'm really grateful to him.
Well, so, listeners, if you don't trust me on this one, you can trust Hampton because the book is fantastic. Haley, thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you, Brendan. It was a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Haley, thank you so much for coming on. A Flower Traveled in My Blood, one of the books of the year. Just trust me. Get it. You're going to be blown away. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.